Okay, let's talk some analytics and let's talk some running the football. I do believe actually the first page of the analytics handbook is just simply saying, running is stupid, never run, running backs suck, all that stuff. That seems to be how it works, but obviously that's not exactly how this stuff works. I wanted to kind of think about, okay, let's look at teams that run the ball more than average, and let's talk about how well does that affect them and how well does it actually benefit your team. There's the one stat that people throw around, it's always silly, which is teams that run the ball more do win more. But the reason why that's obviously silly is because if you're winning in the fourth quarter, you run the ball more. If you're losing in the fourth quarter, you throw the ball more, which it typically is probably the reason for that. So how do we figure out if it's a better idea to run the ball more or pass the ball more? Well, first we have to figure out which offenses are better or worse. So I use points per drive. That's my favorite metric. I think that's the most accurate metric because that's, at the end of the day, what you're trying to do in football, right? Score as many points per drive as possible, at least in terms of the offense, and then the defense is prevent as many points per drive as possible. So that's the metric I decided to use. And then for running, again, I could have just used carries, who runs the ball more, but that didn't feel exactly right. What I decided to do instead was I used run above expected. And what this means is it's a rush above expected, so it's taking situation into account. For example, on a 3rd down and 1, the chances are that you're more likely to run the ball than on a 3rd down and 10, and so it takes that into account. So then I looked at which teams run the ball on average more than expected and which teams run the ball on average less than expected, and just wanted to see how does it correlate with the teams that, have better or worse offenses. So this is the chart that I created, and it's a bit of a mess, quite frankly. It's got to explain what it is. So, at the bottom, you see those are the list of teams, and the red line that's going to be sort of towards the bottom, that is simply where each of these teams placed in terms of how often did they throw the ball or run the ball. So the team that threw the ball the most were the Kansas City Chiefs, who threw the ball 11% more than expected. The team that, they threw the ball 11% more than expected. The team that ran the ball the most more than expected was the Lions. So they threw the ball 10% less than expected. Essentially, the higher you are on this chart, the more you threw the ball than expected. The lower you are on this chart, the more you ran the ball than expected. The purple line, that is going to be how well your offense was. So this is where your offense ranked in terms of points per drive. And in hindsight, I could have tried to organize this in a different way. But the way it works is that the closer you are to the bottom of the chart, the better your offense is. So you do kind of see I feel like a gradual tick going up. It's definitely very mountainy, right? There's a lot of spikes. It's not a straight line whatsoever. But there is a slight tick up, which does mean that throwing the ball more does equate to having a better offense than running the ball more. Right off the bat, there's a selection bias at play. Typically, if you have a better offense, if you have a better quarterback and a better wide receiving core, you're probably just going to be more likely to throw the ball more. So because of that, that might be a factor into it. Whereas if you have a running back, you might be good running back, you're more likely to run the ball more. But a good running back doesn't give you as much more value than a good quarterback and wide receiver. So there is that bit of selection bias at play, and that is something that we probably have to mention. And I also want to talk about just the difference between the teams that run the ball a ton and the teams that throw the ball a ton. The average top 5 team last year had 2.6 points per drive, whereas the average bottom 5 team had 2.2 points per drive. So a pretty significant jump at 0.4 of a point per drive. That would add 2.04 wins if you take that over an entire season. And that's a huge jump. That's more than a good offensive line is, a great offensive line. That's more than the difference between the best offensive line and the worst offensive line. So that's kind of what we're talking about here. Just throwing the ball on the top 5, of the league, that means that you're much more likely to score more points. And one thing that has to be mentioned, probably could have mentioned it earlier, but I'll mention it now, is that I actually took out when a team has less than 20% chance to win out of this data. So when I'm talking about running the ball over expected or throwing the ball over expected, I am excluding when the game is practically over. So it's only when both teams have at least a decent chance to win. So that way both teams are probably still going to just run their offense the way they typically would. Anyway, there were some exceptions to this rule. There were teams that threw the ball a lot and didn't have a great offense. The Miami Dolphins threw the ball 4% more than expected, but their points per drive was on the lower side at 1.68. The New York Giants actually had the worst points per drive in football, despite throwing the ball 2% more than expected. And then teams like the Eagles, 49ers, Patriots, and Titans all had solid offenses, despite running the ball a lot more, consistently. So there were definitely teams that had success running the ball effectively, and that's probably my biggest takeaway from this. Personally, I believe, I am from the school of thought of you play to your personnel, right? What's the best way to have success given your personnel? And I think that the San Francisco 49ers last year went from, instead of being 8% under expected, were 8% over expected, and they were throwing the ball constantly. I don't know if they get better. I think there's a very real and logical reason to believe that they could have actually had a much worse offense. Like same thing with the Patriots, who had a good offense, 2.63 points per drive. That's better than the average team that, throws the ball top 5. So they overperformed that despite running the ball a ton. And so because of that, if they threw the ball a lot more, maybe their offense gets worse. Now, maybe it gets better as well. I don't know, but there's reason to believe at least that having an effective running offense can be a benefit. One thing I was surprised by is like a team like the Colts actually were around middle of the pack in terms of running the ball more than expected, even though they're kind of thought of as a team that like almost made the playoffs due to their running game, but that wasn't really true. But I do think that it is a fair takeaway to say that given your situation, it does sometimes make sense to be a good running team. I think that that's legitimately reasonable and fair. I also think that it's fair to say that here's just something that I just believe is true. If you're a great passing attack, you're going to be better as a football team than if you're a great running attack. And if you're a team that builds to try to make your passing game great and then throws the ball really well, you're going to have better luck than a team that builds to the running game and tries to be a great running team. Because, again, it's not like you're just a coach here. Sometimes this is the GM thing, right, of you work together. If you're a GM, you might sit here and say, let's try to be a team that has a great passing attack instead of a team that has a great rushing attack. Because, you think about the couple of teams that were the exceptions in terms of teams that threw the ball a lot but still didn't have effective offenses. It was like the Miami Dolphins, who, listen, with the Miami Dolphins, I think that them throwing the ball a lot probably did make their offense better than it would have been had they ran the ball a lot. Because that's another aspect here. You're not just going to inherently be great simply because you throw the ball more. But I think they might have actually been worse had they been a run-first team instead. Same thing with the Giants. The Giants had Jake Fromm out there, and that team was absolutely abysmal. That was, when Mike Glennon and Jake Fromm were out there, that team had nothing going. I don't care if they threw the ball every snap. And again, who knows? Every snap might have been a worse thing for them. But I don't care, how much you're throwing the ball, I guess I should say. It's not going to do anything. You're still going to be a worse team. So I don't think that, I think that that's an interesting aspect. And, teams like the Patriots, they might have actually been better if they threw the ball more. The Titans might have been better if they threw the ball more, even though they were good when they ran the ball. We just don't know currently. And actually, a couple of teams that I had, underperforming in terms of in the regular season, one of those teams was the Patriots. The Patriots, my algorithm said that they were a really good team last year, but did underperform. But then the Titans overperformed, and they also ran the ball just as much. So at the end of the day, who knows with this stuff entirely? I think the way I take this data is, from a team building perspective, I'd rather build a team that has a great passing attack. But if you're forced to do the other side, don't be afraid to. Don't be afraid to be a run heavy team if that's what you have to do. But you should ideally try to be a pass happy team. That's kind of how I think. What do you guys think? Let me know in the comments below. What are your thoughts on all of this stuff? Always love hearing from you. And of course, as always, thanks for watching.